My name is Ben Leard, and this paper is joint with Josh Lin and Clay Munnings at RFF. And in this paper, we're trying to really look at the evolution of travel demand over time. In particular, or I guess to motivate this question of looking at travel demand, kind of this figure has been presented in different ways several times this conference. This is kind of a different way. This is CO2 emissions by sector in the US, broken by transportation, electric power, industrial, and residential and commercial. And we see now that transportation is the largest source of CO2 among those four sectors. And a lot of that is really coming from passenger vehicles. About 60% of overall CO2 is from cars and trucks that you and I drive. And looking at CO2 from transportation, in particular from light duty, it's really a matter of how much people are driving. So this point's already been made. But this is a different way to plot the data. This is looking at VMT, vehicle miles traveled per licensed driver over time relative to 1975. So the vertical axis is all relative to 1975 total national annual miles. So we see kind of a gradual increase for about 20 years, about 1 or 2% growth rate, and then this peaking, kind of a peak in the mid to late 2000s and a slight decline. And so in our paper, we're really trying to understand what caused this peak. So we're going to zoom in on that kind of mid to late 2000s period to really get a sense of what caused that peak. And then we want to talk about what this means for future VMT growth. There have been a couple different hypotheses for this mid-2000s peaking and decline. The first, which Lang has already mentioned, kind of this Amazon effect. Basically, people during this period with the advent of Amazon no longer were going out to Walmart, but instead would just order their goods and services and have them delivered. So that's going to reduce trip demand. Another hypothesis is this millennials kind of concept, and that there's greater demand among younger individuals for things like public transit, so they don't want to own the cars anymore. And then also what Lang had already mentioned, kind of this connectivity over the internet. And a third category, which is what we really focus on with our model, is what we call changes in household demographics and economic characteristics. So these are things like changes in income, employment, things like the age distribution, gasoline prices. We kind of lump those all together in this third category. Whereas the first two are really kind of unobserved in the sense that we called them changes in driving habits. It's just a terminology. Basically, you look at the same demographic and the same kind of economic environment, and those people just drive less. So that would be kind of a change in habits. And which explanation is correct is going to have huge implications for future oil consumption and GHG emissions. Our paper is really, we have kind of a twofold objective, two sets of objectives. The first being we want to explain the slowdown in the mid to late 2000s. A preview of our results is that we find that most of it, pretty much almost all of it, is from changes in the economic environment. So things like gas price changes were a big factor. Depressed incomes and really high unemployment. We find that they explain mostly all of the slowdown. And then with our model, what we do is we predict, based on the estimates from our model, we predict growth in travel demand through 2025, so kind of like a medium run prediction, not too far off. And we find that we predict growth to be around a little bit less than 1%, so not huge, but definitely positive. And this is going to increase consumption of oil and greenhouse gas emissions relative to a setting where driving habits would be the cause of this slowdown. So jumping into the data sets that we use for our analysis, the first is called the Current Population Survey. It's a pretty well-representative survey of the US in terms of demographics and their income. We have, from the data, we compute the number of households by it's also every single year, which is really nice. We compute household counts by year, income category, and their demographic category, and we kind of bin households into different groups. So we have income is binned by $5,000 increments. We have demographics like the age of the household head, things like household size, whether or not how many workers they have, if they live in an urban environment, other things like age and education and race. And we combine these count data of households with travel demand data. So this data set is a fairly well-known data set for travel demand. It's the National Household Travel Survey. It's done not very frequently. It's about every 5 to 8 years. The most recent one that just came out is for 2017. Before that, it was 2009. We leveraged 3 of the waves. So starting in the mid-90s, that wave is kind of our benchmark wave. And what we do is we compute a household level VMT. So in the survey data, we observe VMTs for each car that a household owns. And what we do is we sum those up at the household level. So we have a household level travel demand for every household in the survey. And then to combine these data with the CPS, what we do is we create the same demographic variables to match the CPS. So we bin households by $5,000 increments for their income. We use the same demographics that we have with the CPS data. And the reason that we're kind of we leverage the strengths of these two. That's why we use both and not just one. For example, the CPS is annual, so we can do our forecasting and our predictions at an annual level versus every 5 to 8 years with just an NHTS. Whereas the NHTS has the demand data, so that's how we use that. The methodology that we use for our analysis is that we're estimating a household level equation using the 1995 sample. And the basic idea is that we're putting households into these kind of demographic cells. So we have about 100 different demographic groups, and they're differentiated by income, the number of workers, and their age. So age is every five-year increments. And the reason we've chosen these is that we've looked at kind of different ways to slice the data. And we find that this slice, kind of these 3 key groups, really explains a lot of the cross-sectional variation in travel demand. We also assume, to account for changes in gas prices, we assume an elasticity from the literature of about equal to minus 0.1, which is kind of in the middle of that estimate from the literature. So then once we have that defined, we then take our model and then we predict VMT at the national level for every single year after 95. So we do 20 years of prediction. And we do that by multiplying the average driving in each group by the number of CPS household counts for that group for every year from 96 through 2015. And with these predictions, we then compare what we predict, with actual observed VMT data from several sources that I'll talk about in a second. And the key comparison, this comparison really lets us understand what is really driving changes in VMT over time. Is it these unobserved kind of driving habits, or is it things that we put in our model, such as demographics and changes in the economic characteristics of households? So jumping to the results, this is a plot of our prediction along with plotting aggregate estimates from different sources. So the vertical axis is total national vehicle miles traveled. It's the sum across all households. The dashed line in the middle is our prediction. So you can see that it gradually went up, kind of tapered off and went down a bit in the mid to late 2000s, and it started to go back up. And so it's not exactly overlying either of the two estimates for VMT. So the little blue triangles are the individual NHTS VMTs, and the FHWA has their own estimate of VMT every year. But we see that the trend is pretty similar, so we think we're doing a pretty good job with predicting. To summarize this, we think that our model is really predicting it does a good job to predict this slowdown that we saw in the mid to late 2000s. The magnitudes are different, but the overall growth rates are pretty similar. We think we're doing a pretty good job with growth rates in different periods. We find about 2% during the pre-2000s period, and then this very slow growth in the 2000s. So after that part of the paper, we then take our model and we do forecasting. We do a prediction out to 2025, so about 8 years into the future. And what we find is that we predict annual growth to be about 1% per year, a little bit less than 1%. And this is comparable to the EIA projection of about 1.4%. So we're kind of in the ballpark of what they find. And so this graph, again, is relative to a base year, which is 2012. And the top lines are our kind of benchmark predictions. And then to understand what is really driving this continued growth in VMT, we do another prediction where we say, just suppose that income was to remain fixed at 2015 levels. So that is the dashed dotted line that's below the two other curves on top. And so if you look at starting in 2015 and you trace that out all the way to 2025, there really isn't very much growth at all in VMT if you fix income. So this is really suggestive that income growth and like the shifting of the income distribution over time is what we predict is causing this possible increase in VMT through 2025. Just a quick comment about ride sharing, what's happening with ride sharing. We have data on ride sharing now with the most recent NHTS survey. The 2017 survey had questions about ride sharing. So this is plotting ride sharing as well as taxis. So the one unfortunate thing with the NHTS data is that it lumps together taxis with ride sharing, but that's actually not bad for comparing across the surveys, because in 2009 there were taxis and people did take taxis. And so the blue boxes, the blue rectangles were for 2009, which include taxis, whereas the red is 2017. So we see a pretty large increase in overall ride sharing, which is what you'd expect, but the overall magnitude is still pretty small. So the axis here is the percentage of total VMT. And so that number is 0.5%, so it's all less than 1%. And so this is suggestive that there has been a lot of growth in this way of traveling, and it might have an impact kind of like 10 to 15 years out, but we don't think it'll have a huge impact on the next 5 or so years because it's still very small. So wrapping up, just to kind of summarize what we've done with this paper, we estimate a household level travel demand model, and we find that with putting in pretty simple demographics and characteristics, we can replicate this slowdown in the data using our benchmark data that we estimate the model with is from the mid-90s, and we can replicate the slowdown in the late 2000s, which really suggests that this slowdown was primarily due to changes in the economic environment and changes in demographics. And finally, we take our model and we predict about a 1% growth rate through 2025, which really has the effect of making achieving greenhouse gas reduction targets even more challenging. So we're going to have either more stringent CAFE standards, or we're going to have something else like an increase in the federal gasoline tax or some type of carbon tax to really meet these objectives. And that is it, and I thank you for your time.